April 11, 1945. The Buchenwald concentration camp on the Ettersberg Hill above the city of Weimar, Thuringia, liberated by soldiers of the 6th Armored Division approximately 2 hours ago. The city of Weimar sits 7 kilometers to the south, the city of Goethe and Schiller, the city that gave its name to the German Republic that preceded the regime that built this place. The proximity was not accidental. The men who selected this hilltop for this purpose understood something about the location that historians would spend decades trying to articulate. The camp holds, at the moment of liberation, approximately 21,000 survivors in conditions that the American soldiers entering the gate for the first time this morning have no framework to process and no language adequate to describe to themselves or to anyone who was not present. General Patton, who visited the Ohrdruf subcamp 1 week earlier, vomited outside the gate and ordered every available American soldier and German civilian in the vicinity to tour the compound so that the evidence could not be denied by any proximity argument. The American officers moving through Buchenwald now are moving through it with the focused attention of men who have been ordered to document what they see and who are discovering, compound by compound and barracks by barracks, that the documentation order was given because the thing being documented is so far outside the normal range of human experience that it will require irrefutable physical evidence to be believed by people who were not present. One of the American officers inside the gate this afternoon is not moving through the compound in a systematic documentation sweep. He is moving through it with a purpose that no one issued to him in orders, because no orders existed for what he is doing, because no one in the United States Army had written a procedure for what it means when a Jewish chaplain enters a concentration camp and begins looking for the living. Rabbi Herschel Schacter was 27 years old. He was born in the Bronx, New York in 1917. The son of Jewish immigrants who had come to the United States from Eastern Europe in the early years of the century and who had built, in the specific matter of Jewish immigrant families in New York, a life organized around the synagogue, the neighborhood, the Yiddish language press, and the careful negotiation between the Old World's forms and the New World's requirements. Herschel was the son who was going to become a rabbi, which in a household like his was both a professional designation and a description of what a person fundamentally was. Not what they did for a living, but what they were made of, the grammar underlying every sentence they would ever speak. He was ordained at Yeshiva University, a young man with a gift for speaking to people in the language they actually thought in rather than the language they were supposed to use in formal religious contexts. He took a pulpit at a Bronx congregation before the war, a congregation of several hundred families, many of them immigrants or the children of immigrants, people with families still in the cities and towns of Eastern Europe that the war was systematically destroying. He knew by 1942 that the family members of people in his congregation were dying in those cities and towns because the reports reaching American Jewish organizations by late 1942 were clear enough in their outline even when their scale was not yet fully comprehensible. He enlisted as a military chaplain in late 1942, assigning himself to the Third Army because a rabbi advancing with an army toward Germany was in a position to be present when the advance arrived at the places where the reports said the dying was occurring. This was not a strategic calculation in the military sense. It was the decision of a man who understood that a rabbi's most essential function was to be present at the moments that most required presence, and that the moments requiring presence in 1944 and 1945 were on the eastern side of the German border rather than in the Bronx. He crossed into Germany with Patton's army in March 1945, conducting services for soldiers in foxholes and field hospitals, burying men with whatever ceremony the forward position permitted, writing letters to Bronx families about sons who had died in Europe in places those families had sometimes themselves fled. He was advancing towards something that he did not know the specific form of, but that he understood was waiting for him in the manner that a person who has spent a life studying the weight of history understands when history is about to present itself in its most extreme form. He entered the gate of Buchenwald on the afternoon of April 11, 1945, 2 hours after the first American soldiers had broken through the SS perimeter, carrying a field notebook, a jeep, and every word of Yiddish he had ever learned in the Bronx. SS Standartenführer Hermann Pister was 59 years old, a career SS officer from Lübeck who had administered the Buchenwald concentration camp since 1942. He was not the man who built the camp, Buchenwald had been established under Karl Otto Koch in 1937, but he was the man who administered it through its most lethal years, overseeing operations that by the spring of 1945 had resulted in the deaths of approximately 56,000 of the 250,000 people who had passed through its gates. He was a methodical man who had brought to the management of a concentration camp the same administrative thoroughness he had brought to every previous organizational task in 20 years of SS service. He had not personally killed the 56,000. He had supervised the system that killed them, authorized the procedures, maintained the personnel, approved the records, and run the operation with the managerial competence that the SS administrative apparatus recognized and rewarded through rank and commendation. By April 10th, with the sound of American artillery audible from the camp for 3 days, Pister was among the SS personnel who evacuated before the Americans arrived, leaving behind guards who did not move quickly enough and 21,000 survivors who were, in his departure, transformed from administrative subjects into witnesses. He was captured by American forces 4 days after the liberation. He was calm and organized in the processing. He described himself as a camp administrator whose function had been organizational management. He was correct. This was precisely what made him, in the language of the legal framework being assembled by Allied prosecution teams that same spring, directly responsible for everything the organization had managed. By the spring of 1945, the liberation of German concentration camps was proceeding at a pace that Allied preparation had not adequately anticipated, because the scale of what the camps contained exceeded every prior estimate. At Buchenwald itself, the camp's underground resistance committee, prisoners who had organized themselves across years of captivity, had been transmitting radio signals to Allied command requesting immediate liberation for 3 days before American forces arrived, which meant that the soldiers entering the gate on April 11th were entering a place that knew they were coming. The camp's Jewish prisoners, who had been subjected to more systematic death transfer operations than other prisoner categories across the final months of the war, as the SS attempted to eliminate the most evidentially damning population before the Allied advance reached the gates, had been reduced to a remnant that included a significant proportion of children who had survived through the specific interventions of adult prisoners who had hidden them, fed them portions of their own inadequate rations, and kept them out of sight during SS selections. Some of these children had not been outside their barracks in months. The youngest of them had spent a portion of their conscious lives inside Buchenwald's wire, and among the Jewish American military personnel advancing into Germany with Patton's army, there was a specific knowledge operating alongside the general knowledge available to all Allied soldiers, the knowledge of what the words in the reports meant in terms of family and community and language and the world that had existed before the war, that shaped what entering Buchenwald meant for a Jewish chaplain in a way that it could not mean for anyone who did not carry that specific weight. Schacter entered the camp and began moving through the compound, calling out in Yiddish. He called the words that any person who had grown up speaking Yiddish in a Jewish household would recognize as the language of recognition itself. Words that said not only that freedom had arrived, but that the person speaking was one of theirs, that the distance between the two sides of what had happened had been crossed by someone making the crossing in the language that the other side had spent years attempting to eliminate as a living tongue. He drove the jeep through the main compound, calling out, and was answered first by sounds that a man trained in the liturgical traditions of his people might have recognized as the specific vocal quality of prayer under conditions of extremity, and then by figures emerging from barracks doorways and from the spaces between buildings, with the careful, deliberate movement of people whose bodies had learned not to move too quickly in the presence of any official vehicle. He stopped the jeep when he could not move it further through the crowd forming around him, and stood up in the vehicle and continued speaking in Yiddish to the people around him, telling them that their names, their actual names, not the numbers the camp had substituted, were their own to keep, and that the language they had grown up speaking was a language they were free to use aloud. Survivors interviewed decades later described this moment in terms that overlapped across the years and the different testimonies in the specific way that genuine memories overlap. The quality of hearing Yiddish spoken by a man in an American military uniform, which was an impossible combination in the grammar of everything the camp had taught them about what uniforms meant, and the several seconds required to resolve the impossibility into something they could respond to. He distributed rations from the jeep. He opened his field notebook and wrote down the names of the people who came to him and where they had come from before the camp, the pre-war geography of a Jewish world that the camp had tried to make into a permanently closed question. He filled 2 pages in the first hour. In the deep interior of the barracks building nearest the camp's eastern fence, an 8-year-old boy named Yisrael Meir Lau was concealed in the narrow space between 2 rows of wooden bunks where older prisoners had hidden him during the chaos of the American arrival, because children in the camp had learned through years of experience that any unusual movement by uniformed personnel required immediate concealment regardless of the uniform's national origin. The difference between German uniforms and other uniforms being a distinction that the camp's children had not been allowed the safety to develop. The boy had been born in Piotrków, Trybulowski, Poland in 1937, the son of a rabbi whose family's rabbinical lineage extended back across many generations. He had entered Buchenwald with his older brother Naphtali, who had kept him alive through years of captivity by the strategies available to a slightly older child in an adult prisoner population, hiding him, feeding him portions of his own inadequate rations, positioning him in the camp's social geography in the places least likely to attract SS attention during selections. Yisrael was 8 years old and could speak Polish, Yiddish, and the rudimentary German of a child who had learned it by listening to guards. He did not speak English. He had never seen an American before April 11, 1945. When the older prisoners in his barracks told him it was safe to come out, he emerged into the Thuringian spring light of a camp that smelled different from any previous day of his conscious life, and moved toward the sound of a voice speaking Yiddish from somewhere in the direction of the main compound, because a voice speaking Yiddish was the first familiar sound his world had produced in a very long time. Schacter found the boy in the late afternoon of April 11th, making his way through the compound toward the sound of the jeep. He was, by every account Schacter gave across the decades, the smallest person he had encountered all day, which was itself a statement that required understanding what he had seen all day to fully comprehend. He asked the boy in Yiddish what his name was. The boy told him. He asked how old he was. The boy told him. He asked where his parents were. The boy looked at him with the specific expression that children develop when they have been living for years with the knowledge that a question has an answer they are not going to say in public, because saying it in public is a behavior the camp has trained them not to perform. Schacter did not press the question. He picked the boy up and held him and said in Yiddish that it was over, which was the simplest and most accurate and in some respects the most inadequate thing a person could say in that moment, and which was what the boy needed to hear in those specific words in that specific language before any other word could be useful. The boy said nothing. He held on to the rabbi's uniform jacket with both hands in the grip of a child who has learned to measure safety by the degree of physical contact available. 4 days later, on April 15, 1945, the first night of Passover, Rabbi Herschel Schacter organized and led a Passover Seder inside the liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. He had sent requests through military supply channels for whatever could be assembled in 4 days appropriate to the Seder: matzah, wine, the ritual foods of a holiday whose central narrative was the deliverance of a people from slavery, a holiday whose entire liturgical apparatus was designed to say, in the presence of those who had been enslaved, that this had happened before, and that the people had survived it, and that the survival was itself a form of testimony required to be spoken aloud every year. He assembled several hundred survivors in one of the camp's larger spaces, men and women and children sitting in a place that had been designed for their extermination, conducting the ceremony that their tradition had conducted every spring for 3,000 years, specifically in memory of the fact that extermination had been attempted before and had not permanently succeeded. He led the Seder in Hebrew and Yiddish. He translated portions into Polish and Hungarian for survivors who did not know the liturgical languages well enough to follow the Hebrew text. He cried during the Ha-Lakma Anya, the opening declaration that begins with the words, "This is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in Egypt," and he did not stop leading the Seder when he cried, because stopping was not something the Seder permitted, the same way that the survival in the room did not stop for what it had cost. Yisrael Lau was in the room. He knew the Seder. He had learned it from his father, the rabbi from Piotrków, before his father did not come back from wherever the trains had taken him. He followed the service in a voice that several people present described in interviews conducted many years afterward as the clearest voice in the room. Schacter remained at Buchenwald for 6 weeks after the liberation, conducting services, recording names, and writing letters. He wrote to families in the United States about relatives whose names appeared in the camp's surviving records. Some of the letters he wrote in this period arrived in New York to people who had not yet received official notification of what they contained. He wrote 65 letters to members of his own Bronx congregation about relatives whose names appeared in the Buchenwald records. These were the most difficult writing he had ever done and remained, for the rest of his long life, the writing he described as the most important. He was discharged in late 1945 and returned to his congregation in the Bronx. He spent the following decades as a rabbi and community leader, speaking publicly about Buchenwald and about the Passover Seder in interviews and testimony given across 50 years without the account changing in any significant detail, which is the specific characteristic of testimony about something a person was completely present for rather than something they have remembered into a shape. He died in 2016 at the age of 98. His obituaries described him as a military chaplain who had helped liberate a concentration camp, which was accurate as far as it went and which did not capture what it meant that the liberator had driven through the gate, calling out in the language that the camp had been designed to silence permanently. Herman Pister was tried before the American Military Tribunal at Dachau in 1947, in proceedings specifically addressing the administration of Buchenwald and its subcamps. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. He did not survive to his execution. He died of a heart attack on September 28, 1948, in Landsberg Prison, Bavaria, the same facility where Adolf Hitler had been imprisoned in 1924 and where he had written the book that contained the ideological blueprint for everything Pister had spent his career administering. The filing system Pister's administration had maintained, the same meticulous records that documented 250,000 prisoner intakes and 56,000 deaths, provided significant portions of the evidence used against him at his own trial. He died in the building where the ideology that had made his career possible had been given its first major literary form. The proximity, as with the Ettersberg Hill above Weimar, was not accidental. Yisrael Meir Lau survived. He was brought to Palestine with other child survivors in 1945 and 1946, part of the Youth Aliyah network moving surviving Jewish children from the ruins of European Jewish life toward the land being built there. He grew up, was educated, was ordained as a rabbi, and entered Jewish communal leadership. He served as the Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi of Israel from 1993 to 2003, the most senior position in the Israeli rabbinical structure, a position that required him to speak publicly and regularly about the nature of Jewish life and the obligations that survival generates. He wrote a memoir in Hebrew whose title translates as, "Do not raise your hand against the boy," the phrase Abraham says to the angel who stops him from sacrificing Isaac, describing his experiences from Piotr Kuv through Buchenwald and across the decades that followed. He described Buchenwald not as the end of something, but as the beginning of a testimony he was required to carry and deliver, which is the rabbinical understanding of survival, that it is not an exemption from obligation, but the assignment of a specific one. He remembered the rabbi who had driven through the camp calling in Yiddish. He remembered being picked up and held. He remembered the Passover Seder 4 days after liberation. He said in interviews that the Seder inside Buchenwald was the most significant religious experience of his life, more significant than his ordination and more significant than his installation as chief rabbi, because the Seder inside Buchenwald was the moment when the tradition that the camp had been designed to end demonstrated in the most direct possible form that it had not ended. He and Herschel Schacter met again decades after the liberation, two men who had been a 27-year-old rabbi and an 8-year-old boy in a Thuringian concentration camp on April 11, 1945, and who had each spent the intervening decades carrying what that afternoon had placed in their hands. Some historians of the Holocaust and of the American military's role in the liberation of the camps have argued that the experience of Jewish American military personnel, chaplains, soldiers, intelligence officers at the moment of liberation has been systematically underexamined in the historical literature, which has tended to focus on the institutional and political dimensions of liberation, rather than on the specific human experience of the Jewish Americans who entered the camps, understanding, in a way their non-Jewish fellow soldiers could not fully share, what the camps represented in relation to the world the survivors had come from. They argue that the encounter between Jewish American servicemen and Jewish European survivors at the moment of liberation was a distinct historical event within the larger liberation, a recognition across the distance of the ocean and the war and the different fates that had produced two groups of people who shared a language and a tradition and who encountered each other across a divide that neither group could fully articulate in any language, including Yiddish. Others have focused specifically on what the Passover Seder inside Buchenwald represents as a historical moment in the religious sense, noting that the Seder's central narrative, the liberation of an enslaved people, was being enacted inside the 20th century's most extreme form of organized enslavement, and that this enactment was not symbolic but literal, and that the tradition was therefore doing precisely what it was designed to do in the moment that most required it. What is certain is that on April 11, 1945, a rabbi from the Bronx drove a jeep through the gate of Buchenwald concentration camp and called out in Yiddish to the people inside, and that one of the people who heard him was an 8-year-old boy from Poland who grew up to become the Chief Rabbi of Israel and who spent the rest of his life carrying the testimony of what he had heard that afternoon in the specific language in which he had heard it, because a testimony carried in the language in which it was received is the only kind that does not lose something in translation. If you had been in that compound on April 11th, as the rabbi, as the boy, or as one of the 21,000 people who heard a voice calling in Yiddish from an American military vehicle, what would you have understood in that moment that could not be said in any other language? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you believe the stories that live at the exact point where a people's worst moment and its survival meet deserve to be told in their full weight, subscribe, because this series is not finished with what the record still contains.